My father lifted his crystal glass of bourbon across the private dining room at the Belle Meade Country Club and pointed the rim directly at my chest. Your brother Preston was just confirmed as Chief Operating Officer at Aerotech Dynamics, Dad announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over 18 dinner guests. A $320,000 compensation package. That is what relentless ambition looks like. A polite murmur of applause rippled through the room while my father smiled at me with that familiar clinical pity. To him, I was the daughter who had wasted her life in a dusty brick workshop off 4th Avenue, restoring antique wooden cellos. He had no idea that behind that historic workshop, I owned and controlled Vanguard Precision Systems, a $48 million aerospace calibration firm holding sole-source defense contracts across 5 states. I didn't say a word. Then, Harrison Croft, the managing director of the private defense syndicate backing my brother's firm, looked across the table, froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips, and set it down so hard the stemware rang. The color drained from Croft's face in 3 seconds flat. He didn't see an eccentric woodworker in a dark sweater. He saw the only certified defense supplier in the Southeast who held the power to ground his company's $18 million federal procurement contract by Monday morning. My father tapped a cream-colored envelope on the tablecloth, completely oblivious. Preston has offered to create an entry-level document clerk role for you at $52,000 a year, Willa, Dad said, leaning forward with an expectant smirk. Say thank you to your brother. Then Croft's phone began vibrating against the mahogany. He looked at the screen, looked up at me, and said the words that stopped my father's celebratory toast dead in its tracks. Excuse me, Thomas, but why is the majority shareholder of Vanguard Precision sitting at your table without a seat on our board? For as long as I could remember, my father, Dr. Thomas Mercer, measured human worth by 3 things: a person's corporate title, their tax bracket, and whether strangers asked for their autograph at fundraisers. He was a prominent orthopedic surgeon in Nashville who ran our family like a hospital surgical floor. Everyone had an assigned rank, and failing to project success was treated as a personal embarrassment. My younger brother, Preston, was 32 and understood the game. He had an engineering degree from Vanderbilt, tailored charcoal suits, and an aggressive, charismatic speaking style that made ordinary quarterly forecasts sound like historic triumphs. At medical malas and holiday dinners, Dad always introduced Preston by his job title before mentioning he was his son. With me, Dad usually sighed, gestured vaguely toward my hands, and said, "Willa restores violins." He made it sound as though I whittled novelty spoons on a highway shoulder. The truth was, I loved my luthier workshop. I loved the smell of aged spruce, the sharp bite of a Japanese carving gouge, and the quiet patience required to graduate a cello soundboard to within 1/10 of a millimeter. That workshop gave me something the corporate world never could: stillness. My grandfather, Arthur, understood that. He was 84, a retired master machinist who had spent 40 years building diesel engine blocks. When the rest of the family spent holidays comparing investment portfolios, Grandfather Arthur would sit beside me, run his rough thumb over the grain of a carved maple scroll, and ask about the acoustics. What my father never knew was that the instrument workshop was only half of my life. 10 years earlier, my first precision manufacturing startup had collapsed during a brutal industrial supply freeze. I had returned to Nashville with $38,000 in personal debt and 2 foreclosed equipment leases. I still remember sitting in Dad's leather-bound study while he reviewed my balance sheet. He didn't ask if I was eating, he didn't ask if I was sleeping, he simply closed the folder, took a sip of scotch, and said, "You lack the operational nerve for high-stakes business, Willa. Stick to low-risk crafts." That sentence stayed with me longer than the debt did. I started over at the absolute bottom. I took a job as a third-shift quality inspector for commercial avionics, learning how aerospace supply chains breathed, how a single uncalibrated tolerance in a titanium fuel valve could ground an entire fleet of aircraft, and how multi-million-dollar defense contractors lost fortunes through outsourced supplier errors. I developed proprietary automated calibration software to eliminate those exact failure points. I formed Vanguard Precision systems, secured AS9100 aerospace quality certifications, reinvested every dollar of net profit into 5-axis CNC machinery, and kept the company strictly private. By 36, Vanguard Precision was an essential sole-source supplier for 3 major defense primes, generating $12 million in net annual earnings. I kept my acoustic workshop as my public sanctuary, drove a 7-year-old station wagon, and never corrected my family when they assumed I was barely clearing $20,000 a year. At first, the silence was about protecting my focus. Later, it became a quiet mirror. I needed to know whether my father was capable of respecting his daughter without knowing her net worth. 4 days before the dinner at Belmead, the answer arrived in a family group chat my mother had created to coordinate the table arrangements. Dad, Preston sits directly beside Harrison Croft. I want Croft observing Preston's executive command firsthand before the contract signing on Tuesday. Mom, Willa can sit at the far end near Arthur. She'll feel less out of place away from the executives. Dad, make sure we announce Preston's new salary, $320,000. Let the contrast speak for itself. After dessert, Preston will present her with the $52,000 administrative clerk offer. In front of 18 people, she won't have the room to make a scene. I read the messages while the varnish dried on a cello backboard. A younger version of me would have called my father in tears. Instead, I cleaned my tools, locked the workshop door, and put on a dark navy sweater. I went to that dinner not to seek revenge, but to watch how they behaved when they genuinely believed I had zero leverage. The country club dining room was filled with cut crystal, heavy silver, and expensive floral centerpieces. Preston sat at the center of the head table, beside Harrison Croft, looking every inch of the rising corporate executive in a custom-cut suit. Dad held court, introducing Preston to private equity directors, while my mother beamed with manufactured pride. Grandfather Arthur leaned close and squeezed my hand beneath the linen tablecloth. "You look like an engineer inspecting a bridge before the charges go off, Willa." "Just watching the stress fractures, Grandfather," I whispered back. Dinner moved through 3 courses of roasted beef and corporate toasts. Preston spoke with effortless confidence about Aerotech's expansion, while Dad practically glowed with pride. Then Dad stood, tapped his crystal glass, and delivered the toast. He announced Preston's $320,000 salary, looked down the table at me, and spoke about helping family members who lacked direction. Preston smiled with rehearsed benevolence, reached into his leather binder, and slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward my plate. $52,000 a year, Willa, Preston said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Document intake and vendor filing. You'll be reporting directly to my operations manager. It's time to trade the wood shavings for a real career. Say thank you to your brother, Willa, my father commanded, leaning forward. I looked down at the envelope. I didn't touch it. That was the exact moment Harrison Croft's phone began buzzing violently across the table. Croft excused himself and stepped into the carpeted anteroom. Through the French glass doors, we could see his relaxed posture vanish into rigid military tension. His voice cut through the glass. "What do you mean the FAA audit failed? We are 72 hours out from federal delivery." Preston's smile began to slip. He reached for his own phone as 3 consecutive priority notifications lit up his screen. "What is it, son?" Dad asked, lowering his glass. Preston's face lost every trace of color. The titanium housing components for the defense contract. Quality assurance just flagged a dimensional drift across 42 units. Then call the backup supplier and expedite a replacement batch, Dad said dismissively. That's why you're the COO. There is no backup supplier, Thomas, Harrison Croft said, walking back into the dining room. His silver hair was still neat, but his eyes were blazing with furious intensity. Aerotech let their Tier 1 AS9100 quality certifications lapse 3 months ago to cut overhead before Preston took the title. The only supplier certified to calibrate and release those titanium housings in the entire region is Vanguard Precision. Preston swallowed hard, looking desperately at his chairman. Then call Vanguard's managing director, offer them triple their expedited rush fee. Croft stopped directly behind my chair. He looked down at me, his jaw set. I am looking at Vanguard's managing director, Preston, Croft said quietly. The dining room went completely motionless. A server holding a silver coffee tray froze near the sideboard. My father blinked, letting out a confused, nervous chuckle. Harrison? What are you talking about? Willa repairs wooden cellos in an old workshop. Your daughter owns 85% of Vanguard Precision systems, Croft stated, his voice ringing like cold iron across the room. She built the automated calibration systems that our defense contracts depend on. Without her facility's sign-off, Aerotech is in material breach of an $18 million federal procurement contract by 5 o'clock on Monday. Preston sank slowly into his chair. His leather binder lay open, the junior clerk offer sitting untouched between our plates. My father stared at me as if the features of my face had rearranged themselves. Willa, Dad whispered, his voice trembling with a bizarre mix of shock and sudden desperate reverence. You own Vanguard, a $48 million enterprise? Why on earth did you never tell me? My God, I always knew you had my business instincts. A sickening wave of clarity washed over me. Look at yourself, Dad, I said, my voice quiet, steady, and utterly cold. 10 minutes ago, you sat at this table and offered me a pity job in front of 18 people to make yourself feel superior. You didn't believe in my instincts when I was building this company from 20-hour shifts in a concrete bay.
Willa, please. I am wearing the same clothes, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I still work with wood. I am the exact same daughter who sat in your study 10 years ago. The only thing that changed in the last 10 minutes is that you realized I hold the keys to your golden child's future. I picked up the cream envelope, folded it once, and slid it directly back in front of my father. You told me to say thank you, Dad, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the silence. I think it's your turn to say thank you to me for not letting this company collapse tonight. Dad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I turned to my brother. I won't let Aerotech collapse tonight, Preston. Not for you and not for Dad's pride, but because 400 machinists and line workers on your assembly floor shouldn't lose their paychecks because your board concealed a quality audit. I looked up at Harrison Croft. My team will review Aerotech's calibration logs under an emergency independent protocol on Monday morning at 7. If Preston's facility meets our technical standards, we certify. If they fail, the contract terminates. There are no family discounts and there are no shortcuts. I stood up from the table. Grandfather Arthur stood with me, a broad, quiet smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Have a wonderful evening, Dad, I said. Enjoy your dinner. The subsequent 7 weeks dismantled the corporate illusion my family had spent years maintaining.
The independent engineering audit revealed that Aerotech's previous executives had concealed 3 consecutive quality failures to artificially inflate quarterly margins before Preston was brought in as the public-facing COO. Harrison Croft forced the immediate resignation of the chief executive officer. Preston was stripped of his executive operating title and reassigned to a technical engineering oversight post, a role where he wore steel-toed boots, carried a clipboard, and spent 50 hours a week learning how precision manufacturing actually worked on a factory floor. My father's reaction was immediate and predictable. He began bragging to his surgical colleagues about his daughter who supplies the Defense Department. At a hospital charity gala 2 months later, he tried to introduce me to the chief of surgery as the owner of Vanguard. I pulled him aside in the lobby before he could finish the sentence.
"Dad," I said calmly, "if you were embarrassed by me when you thought I earned $20,000, you don't get to use my $48 million to buy status at a cocktail party. Do it again and you will speak to me exclusively through my corporate counsel." He turned pale and fell silent. For the first time in his life, he understood that his approval had 0 value. 5 months after Belle Meade, Preston showed up at my workshop on 4th Avenue. He wasn't wearing a tailored Italian suit. He was wearing canvas work pants with grease on the cuffs, holding a paper bag with 2 sandwiches from a local deli. He stood near the doorway, watching me shape the soundboard of a cello with a small bronze plane. "I didn't understand the work, Willa," Preston said quietly, looking around at the wall of hand tools. "I spent 5 years chasing titles so Dad would look at me like I mattered. I never bothered to learn what it takes to actually build something that holds together." I set the hand plane down on the workbench and wiped the cedar shavings from my fingers.
"Sit down, Preston," I said, gesturing to the wooden stool. "Let's have lunch." That was the first real conversation my brother and I had shared in 15 years. The following Thanksgiving, the table was different. There were no country club ballrooms, no corporate guests, and no grand speeches about 6-figure salaries. We gathered at Grandfather Arthur's small farmhouse outside Franklin. Preston arrived on time, his hands calloused from the shop floor, and helped Grandfather carve the turkey. In the center of the wooden table sat an acoustic instrument stand, holding a finished maple cello I had strung that morning. My father looked at the cello for a long moment. He didn't ask what it was worth. He didn't ask who was buying it. He simply reached out, touched the smooth varnish of the scroll with one finger, and said, "The tone on this wood is remarkable, Willa." Standing in the warm kitchen, listening to Preston explain hydraulic pump pressures to Grandfather while the kettle whistled on the stove, I felt something permanent settle in my chest. The night my family discovered my true worth wasn't the night I won. This was the victory, a quiet cable where my value was never up for auction. She revealed the fortress behind the artisan's bench. She refused to let their status games buy her silence. She said, "You told me to say thank you. Now it's your turn."